if you squash the ant in Australia, the instant you squash it in Australia, the hive in Las Vegas goes into chaos. How does that happen? How do they communicate? Unless it's by some other level of reality called the end field, a level at which we're all one. Now, the Maharishi Yogi organization got quite interested in end fields because they thought if we could get a certain number of people meditating all at the same time, could we shift the consciousness on the planet? Because there seems to be this, like the 100th monkey syndrome is like there's a threshold point. Once you go over this particular threshold point, the entire population gets it. And they worked out this threshold point was the square root of 2%, which obviously for the planet is still a big number. But they thought, I wonder if we can alter the consciousness of smaller populations. So they did a couple of experiments. So there was a conflict in the Middle East at this particular point in time. Well, actually, there always seems to be a conflict in the Middle East. There was a conflict in the Middle East, and they thought, I wonder if we got a certain number of people meditating, doing transcendental meditation, on a particular day, all at the same time, in this location, we could change what was happening in the conflict. So they did this, and completely inexplicably, there was a ceasefire on that day. They stopped fighting. Nobody knew why, it wasn't planned, but there was no fighting that day. The next day, when the meditators stopped, they started bombing the shit out of each other again. Now, here was another experiment in New York, in conjunction with the New York police, because they thought, what would happen to the crime rate if we got a whole bunch of people meditating in this particular area of New York? The prediction was that if they got a certain number of people meditating on that particular day, then the crime rate would decrease. So they set it up with the police. And they got as many meditators in the area as possible, and they were going to meditate all day together. And the crime rate on that day absolutely fell through the floor. So there's only two possible things that could have happened on that day. Either the meditators affected the morphogenic field and drove the crime rate down, or all of the criminals in the area were transcendental meditators. That's the only two possibilities in there. So, morphogenic fields, we're all connected. Now, how does that affect you? Well, here's an interesting thing. As soon as we got together in this room, we created a morphogenic field in this room. So all groups of people create a morphogenic field. But then, you see, I don't know if you know this, but every single cell in your body exists as a single-celled organism in nature. So if you did biology at school, you'll probably remember amoebas and protozoas and all that kind of stuff, single-celled organisms. Every single cell in your body exists in isolation as a single-celled organism in nature. So then, rhetorical question again, why did they all decide to get together and create this thing that you know as you? Now, after you studied like amoebas and protozoas, you probably did, if you did the same kind of class as me, hydras. That's the next kind of most complex kind of creature. It's like a tubular thing with tentacles on the top of it, which chucks spores out the top. Now, there's one particular kind of hydra which spends the entire year as a slime of single-celled organisms, just like green slime. Then once a year, for some reason, these cells get together and form a tube with tentacles on the top, and the different cells actually specialize in certain functions to replicate themselves and reproduce. And then once that job's done, they go back into a single-celled organism slime. Now, could it be that is what happens with us? Since every single cell in our body exists as a single-celled organism, do all these single-celled organisms at some particular point in time decide to get together, create a morphogenic field, which is you? The morphogenic field which holds your physical body together. Once that morphogenic field's done its job, then those single-celled organisms go back to being just single-celled organisms. You go back to disappearing into the quantum mush, for want of a better word. Yeah. So, M fields. Now, one of the other postulations within quantum physics, and again, what happens is they notice a particular phenomena, they go, we can't explain that. So then what they do is they come up with a completely new idea that they explain it. And they go, okay, that's the new idea, and guess what? But you see, here's the thing with the observer effect. It's interesting, because I read an article a couple of years ago in a newspaper in England, which said, we found the chemical in the brain that causes dyslexia. And if we could actually come up with a drug that would get rid of that chemical in the brain that causes dyslexia, then we'd have an anti-dyslexia drug. I saw another article which said we found a chemical in the brain that causes happiness. And if we could replicate this chemical artificially, then we'd have happy pills. Some people think they've already invented happy pills, of course. But anyway, think about this from an observer effect point of view. So what you do is you go, right, if there was a chemical in the brain that causes dyslexia, what would it look like? And if it would look like that, let's create an experiment that would enable us to find it. I don't know if you've noticed, but every single time they create an experiment to see if something exists, the answer is always yes. But then from the observer effect point of view, the experiment actually creates the chemical in the brain that causes dyslexia. You'll never know whether it was there before you created the experiment. Yeah. Now, this actually spreads out to even more fundamental things, and I don't know if you know this, but nobody in the world has ever managed to find and isolate and see the HIV virus. Now you might say, well, I've seen it on TV, computer simulated. They were created by asking this question. If there was an HIV virus, what would it look like? And then, if that's what it would look like, what kind of test would we have to do to find it? And guess what? When you create a test to find what would look like the HIV virus, you find it. Now, and this isn't publicized very widely. And the person that created the HIV test has publicly come out and said that it is completely useless. Because who knows whether it's actually finding anything or whether the test actually creates it. Was it there before you went looking for it? You will never know. Now, the interesting thing with this is, some of you have already learned NLP. And in NLP, I don't know if you know about this, but there's this thing about people who have eye patterns, and if they move their eyes in a particular way, then you can tell what it is that they're thinking on the inside. Well, I once asked myself this question. Before I learned NLP, did people have eye patterns? I have no clue. There's this thing in NLP called submodalities, which is like the size of the pictures in your mind, whether they're bright or dim, or whether they're in colour or black and white. I asked myself the question, before I learned NLP, did I have submodality? I have no clue. So this is what's fascinating about tonight. Because if this is the first time you've heard any of this stuff, it didn't exist in your universe before you observed it tonight. But guess what? You'll never now be able to get rid of it. You'll always be wondering whether this is true. It will never, ever, ever go away. But did it exist before tonight? Who knows? So one of the other things that they came up with as an explanation for the way the universe works is that the universe is a hologram. I'm not talking about the kind of hologram